Hello, everyone, and welcome to a virtual conversation on cities and democracy, issues of space, place, and race. I'm Stephen Bosacker, a Senior Vice President at the German Marshall Fund and Director of GMF Cities. Along with our partner, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, we published a collection of 12 essays last Thursday that explores the interplay of democracy on the one hand and the life of cities, and what makes that intersection sometimes important, often chaotic, and usually intriguing. The link to that collection is included in the chat. And in a very analog way, this is what the report looks like. So go looking for it. We certainly think it's a collection worth a read. Right now, click it on and start tonight, or maybe save for your summer vacation. 12 engaging commentaries are shared from urbanists, practitioners, academics, and policymakers, including the mayor from Warsaw, Poland. Today, we've invited 3 of the essay authors to provide a preview of their contribution and then have a conversation afterward. Let me briefly introduce them. You can also find their bios in the chat. Sheila Foster is a professor of law and public policy at Georgetown University. Sheila's been involved in many aspects of urban policy, including as co-director of the Laboratory for the Governance of the Commons, also called LabGov, where she's engaged in the Co-Cities project that reaches into more than 100 cities worldwide. Thanks for being here, Sheila. Daniel Agbiboa is assistant professor of African and African American studies at Harvard University. Daniel's research and teaching focus on how state and non-state forms of order and authority shape each other and the materialization of mobility, power, and politics in contemporary African cities. Daniel, it's so good to have you with us. And Julie Nelson is the Senior Vice President of Programs at Race Forward and the founding director of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, or GARE for short. Julie also serves as a senior fellow with the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, and we are especially pleased to have her as a senior fellow with GMF Cities at the German Marshall Fund. Julie, a good, very early morning to you in Phoenix. Thanks for being here. Before we go to each guest, I want to welcome Samuel Kling, a fellow and director of Global Cities Research at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, for some opening remarks. Sam, it's been so great to work with you and Florida Gunasakara, our other co-editor, these past many months, and I appreciate the strong spirit of collaboration you and Florida brought and the fun you brought to the project. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Stephen. It's an honor to be here speaking with you, and likewise, I want to thank you, Stephen, and to our friends at GMF for your partnership on this project and for helping bring it to fruition in such an outstanding way. So I'd like to give a brief overview of our approach in this essay collection. So I have a few brief remarks. Our purpose in this project has been to explore 2 questions. The first is, what is the role of cities in generating and strengthening democratic practices? And the second is, what is it about cities that makes them such unique democratic actors? Now, these are big, unwieldy questions, but they've become pressing in a world facing democratic backsliding. And leaders on both sides of the Atlantic are looking to cities as leaders on democracy. And there's a lot to recommend cities. They've stood up against rising authoritarianism and populist leadership in North America and Europe. Often they've skirted gridlock and polarization on issues such as climate change and migration. And they've also led on democracy itself, such as in the recent Global Declaration of Mayors for Democracy, which GMF was a partner on, a statement which is now signed by nearly 250 mayors across the world. Moreover, with 2/3 of the world's population expected to live in cities by 2050, the future of democracy is closely connected to urban democracy. Which brings us back to this question: what's the significance of cities? Well, the premise of our project is that cities have unique spatial, social, and political features which can make them creative and powerful generators of democracy. As Benjamin Barber, a political scientist, wrote in his 2013 book, "If Mayors Ruled the World," urban politics tends to be pragmatic. focused on mundane issues like garbage collection. And you might have heard some of these arguments before. Urban voters have a closer connection to local leaders than national ones, and polls consistently show that citizens trust local government more than national government. Often, urban politics is structured at the community level, at the neighborhood level, and not by national parties, which can contribute to this pragmatism. And mayors can more easily take action locally and globally on a range of issues, avoiding the gridlock and partisanship of national politics. But cities also have features which spring from their spatial realities. They are dense, they're diverse, dynamic, and frequently chaotic. They bring together people of different identities, means, and perspectives in proximity. And the urban built environment, from parks and markets to streets and sidewalks to buses and trains, all of these things help structure social relations. They can encourage accommodation and new connections among residents, and they can even encourage a new politics. But there's also a flip side. Cities continually struggle to make democracy actually work. Cities have just as long a history of conflict and exploitation as they do of democratic leadership. Myriad social problems are worse in cities, and today many struggle with inequality, housing, segregation, lack of opportunity, and an inability to deliver basic services. These problems, no doubt, reflect challenges associated with performing democracy itself. So what can cities do? Well, we asked our authors, and I encourage you to read the essay collection to find out, as well as to stay here for this program. But one thing was clear across the essay collection, that while cities can and do struggle to perform democracy, the democracy they create is deeply inherently shaped by the city itself. It's a democracy practiced not just by mayors, but at the neighborhood and community level. So if cities can live up to this billing as global bulwarks for democracy, it won't be because they're simply another layer of government working to achieve, say, national government's geopolitical goals. Instead, it will be on the basis of the potholes filled, the garbage collected, and the inequalities addressed. And ultimately, because they can reshape democracy in their image. Thank you, and Stephen, back to you.
Thanks, Sam. And now to the authors. We will go one by one, taking about 5 to 7 minutes for each guest to offer some selected highlights or ideas from their respective essay. For the audience, you can submit a question we will take up later in our conversation by using the Q&A button on your screen. Please list your first name and from where you are writing along with your question. So let's start with Sheila Foster. Sheila's essay is entitled "The City as an Enabler of Urban Co-Governance." Sheila, you can take it away.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Very excited about the conversation. In my essay, what I do is give some examples and track what I call multi-stakeholder or multi-sector collaborative arrangements that have taken root in U.S. cities. And these often involve a mix of private and public actors, including universities, obviously the local government, neighborhood civic organizations, and other players that are shaping the urban environment, usually through economic development strategies. And the basic argument is that the city or cities can play a transformative role enabling and facilitating these collaborative arrangements in a way that center and empower even the most vulnerable communities as drivers of economic and social development. So, and I've argued with a co-author, Christian Iaioni, in my book, Co-Cities, that these multi-collaborative or stakeholder partnerships have the potential really to be deeply democratic, but that in order to truly create just cities, that neighborhood or community actors have to move from being stakeholders to shareholders in these arrangements. That is to say, instead of simply having a voice in the development or a seat at the table, communities have to share in the value and wealth established by these partnerships. So how does that happen? Well, the city can be a core partner in part by providing the necessary built infrastructure. Sometimes that is the actual transfer of available land or buildings that are under its control to redevelop a particular area of the city. The cities often give legal authority in the or under the guise of, let's say, eminent domain or master developer, or sometimes tax increment financing to effectuate and sustain these partnerships. And sometimes cities utilize their ability to finance goods and services through taxes and fees and special assessments to catalyze these collaborations. So in other words, the city provides a powerful incentive for these actors to come together, to collaborate, to co-create, and to co-govern parts of the city together. But one of the points that I make is that whether these arrangements really result in inclusive development or whether the benefits are shared widely by vulnerable communities depends on how they are structured. And so I make a distinction between what I call top-down partnerships, those that are driven largely by corporate anchor institutions, which initiate a project and then may invite residents and other neighborhood groups to participate, and bottom-up partnerships in which those large actors follow the local community-based organizations or civic organizations and provide support without taking over their vision or initiative. So that's a distinction that I'm happy to talk about later on, but I give some examples of top-down partnerships, such as Philadelphia's University City District and the Cortex Innovation District in St. Louis, and some bottom-up partnerships, such as the Southwest Partnership in Baltimore. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. So I was really pleased, Sheila, to see the city as an enabler concept, and that these co-governance arrangements can be empowered by the city. There are surely advantages to the collaborative partnership itself. I mean, I love this notion of bottom up and something organic happening, but it doesn't always happen. And so the fact that city or city government can actually drive something, I think, is a critical point of your essay. So there are advantages to the partnership, but what do you see that can accrue to a local government that empowers such partnerships outside of government? I was a city manager. There's always a nervousness about giving all this power and authority to other people. And yet, inevitably, when we did, something better happened. So I'm just curious what the government gets by doing this.
So often these large-scale development projects are resisted by some interests in the city, often community interests, but not only community interests, because there's the fear that a lot will be extracted from the communities and not much given to those communities. So I think one benefit to the government is to have these development projects, whether it's expansion of, let's say, a commercial district, or putting new kinds of housing in, or creating an innovation district, that these things go well, right? That they proceed in a way that doesn't cost more money and time of the local government and its private partners than they need to. And so one of the things that the city gets from that is simply efficiency and time. I think the second thing it gets is that it's very hard for cities today, given the complexity of neighborhoods and the different ethnic and class communities at our city. It's very hard to meet all the needs of those different communities. So I would argue that these kinds of arrangements are much more responsive to the needs of very different communities and complex urban environments than a centralized bureaucracy can often deliver.
Great, great, thank you. Well, we're going to have a chance to go further with you and the other authors collectively, so I'll pause there and we will move on. Next up, we will hear from Daniel Agbiboa, who wrote On the Future of Urban Democracy in Africa. Daniel, if you're ready, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for the opportunity. I think a couple of points that I wanted to highlight about this piece is to start by saying that beyond the broader narrative of cities as sites of transformation, as progressive sites, as high-tech spaces. I think what we too often miss is the fact that cities are people, and people are messy. They are contentious. They are emotional, negative, positive emotions, the gray areas between the two. So when we think about the city from this messiness, this contentiousness, this contestation, and even contradiction, what notion of the future emerge, and what notion of the urban and the political emerge? That's the broader issues that I sort of engage with in this topic, to move us beyond looking at the city, in particular cities in the global south, as sites of crisis, as problems to be fixed, to look at not what they are not, but what they really are, and which is that they are sites of productive tension, of creativity, of inventive responses to contingency. I think these are, how do we hold on to this balance of stories about the city that both is able to reflect its capacity for transformative growth, but also reflect its underneath, its underside, it's the messy aspects that are often not reflected in images of the modern city, which African cities in particular aspire towards when they label themselves world-class cities. Lagos, Africa's largest metropolis, for example, calls itself Africa's Big Apple, and we know where it's modeling itself towards. Johannesburg calls itself a world-class African city, and we've seen such iterations also in cities like Mumbai and Shanghai as well. So what is this language of progress? What does it foreclose? This spectacular language, what is the spectral side of it? What is the invisible side of things? I think that's what I want to do. And I think in refocusing, in putting people, in thinking about cities as people, we can both look at ways in which people reproduce life in the city, but at the same time, people are not just included or excluded, but they're included in ways that do damage to them. So in other words, we can move beyond the juxtaposition of inclusion and exclusion and begin to look at the fact that the majority of urban inhabitants do not fall into this category of included or excluded. Rather, they fall into the category of adverse incorporation. The terms under which they are included are the things they're very angry about and they're worried about. And I think we need to begin to engage with those gray areas of cities. And I think that's what this piece tries to highlight.
Well, there was a lot in your essay, and I have to tell you that I was so energized from the first time I read it, about it, and especially this notion that you bring about rethinking urban democracy around the productivity of uncertainty and of complexity, and to think of it as less of a burden and more a resource. And so it really has so much energy, and I'm excited for other people to read it and react to it as well. In the piece, I'd like you to say a little bit more, because I think that you chose a structure around policing, pandemics, and youth-led protests for your essay to kind of serve to support your broader theories around complexity and how it contributes to productivity ultimately and reinvention. Yes. Just say a few more words about that to give people a more tangible sense about what that can bring and build to democracy.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Stephen. I think one of the key points in choosing policing, pandemics, and youth was to highlight the ways in which cities are spaces that can, disrupt our sort of normalized thinking. They can make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. I think, take the example of COVID-19, for example. At the beginning of the pandemic, the predominant narrative in the urban literature was that African cities, this was going to be the end of African cities because of the lack of physical infrastructure. They were going to collapse in a sort of astronomical fashion. Well, that has not happened. And the question is, why has that not happened? And that question cannot be just from passive explanations like climate or talking about the ways in which the people are sort of immune from previous diseases. It has to come from somewhere else. It has to come from that complexity we're talking about, that ability to think about the city, not just in very concrete terms, not just in very spectacular terms, but also in spectral terms. People themselves, the very people became infrastructure in African cities that sort of plugged critical gaps in healthcare, in mobile infrastructures. We began to see the rising of community brokers, neighborhood watch, who came together to sort of disseminate messages across, who became the eyes and ears of the state in a way that perhaps we did not see in the so-called developed cities. And so what is the lesson from this? The lesson is that we have to approach the city from an open-ended perspective, just as we have to approach humans from an open-ended perspective. This suggestion that we can reach a level of developed, both at the city level, that the city can become entirely smart, and that we can reach a level at the human level of development. I think it's a notion that is hubristic and it's unrealistic. I think when we invert our own frame of analysis, and begin to think about it as open-ended, then we can see the ways in which, African cities and cities in the global south are not automatically doomed to fail precisely because they don't have infrastructure, but because people are way more complex than the physical infrastructure, and that they can step in to stitch the city together in times of crisis. So crisis then becomes an opportunity for us to expand our horizon of thinking and to include within it the complexity which the city itself embodies.
Wonderful, thanks. Thanks for that passion on this. I want to get eventually whether there are some lessons for US democracy and in some respects, kind of the neatness or the too neat for us, but let's hold that and we will move on to our third author guest. And that's Julie Nelson, who co-authored an essay with Johnny Powell titled Expanding Just Multiracial Democracy. Julie, you can go ahead.
Thanks, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here and want to start by just emphasizing the title of our document, Just and Multiracial Democracy. We live at a time when democracy is coming under attack across the globe with the rise of authoritarianism and nationalism. We live at a time when it's critical to understand the role that local municipalities can play, not only in defending against democratic backsliding, but also, and I would say even more importantly, expanding the very nature of democracy. So that's our bottom line premise, that local governments are actually uniquely situated to turn grim situations that are based on othering into a global movement grounded in racial justice and belonging. So today there's 4 ideas from our essay that I want to focus on. The first one is this idea of expanding democratic practice. Second one is being explicit about who has and is currently either included or excluded in democracy. Third, focusing on systems and structures as opposed to just individuals. And finally, operationalizing and organizing for multiracial democracy. So first, let's start with this idea of democratic practice. Municipalities do have the opportunity to expand democratic practice at the local level, not just thinking about voting rights at the national level, but really democratic practice on a day in, day out basis. So what that means is that a city's residents can make real decisions that impact communities. A community center's board can, instead of just playing a superficial role, can actually make decisions related to programming, policies, and operations. We have seen this sort of model take place in multiple ways across topics like neighborhood planning, zoning, parks, libraries, policing, transportation. We've seen it happen. Another example is with budget more broadly. Well, participatory budgeting sometimes gets a bad rap because it can be limited in scale. And honestly, it can kind of provide access to people who already had access. What we're seeing is that there are models of expanding participatory budgeting. Participatory budgeting can be a democratic practice where communities and members of the public, including those who have previously been left out, decide how to allocate public funding. I live most of the time in Seattle, and so it's not just because I live there, but one of my favorite examples on participatory budgeting is from Seattle. City of Seattle just launched a $30 million fund for participatory budgeting that came out of a $100 million fund earmarked after community groups demanded investments in communities of color following the protests in the summer of 2020. Now, $30 million is so much more of a significant number than what we have seen taking place in other participatory budgeting processes. And it's being done in a really democratic based process. So would elevate that. My second point is that to expand democratic practice, we have to be explicit about groups that have been excluded, and we must design policies and practices for inclusion and belonging. It's a design question. So to be clear, what has been designed as democracy has been exclusive. So in the US, from the inception of our country, the laws, policies, and practices that determined who could vote, who could own property, who was property, whose land was whose, who could marry whom, all of those were policies and practices based on exclusion. So the fact that we have inequities today is not a surprise. That's the way the system was designed. It's not a random thing, it's not natural. We have racial inequities because they were intentionally created and maintained. And importantly, throughout the history of the United States, people have been fighting to expand democracy. I said the US, but it's a global fight. We must continue this fight. And beyond mere inclusion, belonging allows people to participate in the creation of structures that affect them. So as we move forward, we must not fall prey to a zero-sum game. Our goal is to create practices where all of us belong and flourish and none are left behind. It's also important that while the structure of racism may target marginalized communities, racism also has negative impacts on dominant groups. And it's not just the psychic cost. Consider, for example, that when Tennessee refused to adopt the Affordable Care Act due to the perception that it was a racialized program that benefited Black people and immigrants, it was actually more white people who lost their jobs due to inadequate health coverage. Racism is a system that harms us collectively. My third point, we have to move beyond a focus on individuals to focus on systems and structures. Daniel, I love the way that you use the phrase around what's the problem to be fixed. It's not people who are broken, it's systems and structures. And so at the structural level, we consider democratic institutions to be expressions of belonging. But to achieve belonging, those institutions must not only allow people to be included, they must also be able to make demands on and participate in the co-creation of the system itself. Local municipalities have the opportunity to support a democratic practice that focuses on solutions, developing transformative and equitable solutions that build decision-making power for residents. And I want to emphasize that word power, that we're looking to shift power from the elites to residents. And so we see success when we realign relationships between institutions and the people they are intended to serve, centering on accountability, transparency, and collaboration. One of my favorite examples of this is from my work in Europe last year in Dublin, where the City Council established an intercultural development project as a result of a study on the barriers to accessing services in some neighborhoods. The program helps improve neighborhood conditions and it fosters community cohesion and democratic practices. The last point that I'll quickly make is around moving beyond ideas to focusing on operationalizing and organizing for multiracial democracy. So there's various entities, Stephen mentioned in my introduction, the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, There's other organizing efforts that are focusing on taking ideas, putting them into action, establishing a growth of a model of practice, learning from each other. So networks are building so that we're operationalizing racial equity and organizing both within and between municipalities. So in closing, I want to come back to this idea of rising authoritarianism and note that authoritarians will use wedge issues to gain and maintain power. And so to counter this, we have to mobilize to support democratic institutions that advance racial justice. And again, local municipalities are uniquely situated to advance a just multiracial democracy that recognizes and empowers all groups, including those that have historically been left out of decision-making. This is an approach that allows us to co-create cities, neighborhoods, and communities where everyone belongs and thrives. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Julie. So much there, we're never going to get to it all. I'm glad you mentioned, you spent 6 weeks in European cities a year ago, talking with local community leaders, discussing issues of equity. I'd love if you could say just a few words, given your deep experience with 400 plus cities now that are part of DARE and the work you do on operationalizing racial equity across the United States, about your observations on the differences or similarities you saw compared to US cities. I mean, you don't have to go into great depth, but I mean, is it more alike or is it more different in working on equity between the US and Europe? You uniquely are bringing that kind of to the table today. So if you could just give us a few thoughts.
Yeah, I would have to say that that's a hard question to answer in a short period of time, but I will say quickly that I actually think there's greater similarities. I think that there's slight areas where there are differences. And one of my observations from spending time with the cities fortifying democracy cities was that what we in the US are lacking is that at the local level, we very infrequently actually name democracy. We don't talk about democratic practice. And so I think for us being in the US, being more explicit about democratic practice at the local level, for all the reasons I named, it really is cities that are uniquely situated. And in the European cities, there was a lot of struggle around how we talk about othering. And there's a reality that sort of different proxies are sometimes used. There's a lot of sort of skirting around language and getting to a higher degree of rigor so that if we can't talk about problems of exclusion, then we're never going to be able to solve them. And so being able to talk about race and ethnicity and other areas of marginalization, the intersections with gender and class and migration status, it's a conversation that's really ripe to be happening. And I will say that at the community level, it is happening, and there's a little bit of reticence at the local government, municipal level.
Yeah, great. I'm so glad you talked about this intention. It's one of the biggest lessons we've had in our 2 years of study with cities on democracy. As you know, I opened the Berlin session last summer with the notion that I had spent 30 plus years in public service, thought I was strengthening democracy every day, never once mentioned the word democracy. If we aren't explicit about kind of what we're trying to achieve, we can't expect other people to understand that we're either moving in one direction, kind of enriching or eroding the tenets of and the values of democracy. Okay. Well, thanks to all three of you for your insights and crisp illumination of your ideas. Let's open a group discussion, and I'm going to open by first seeing if you have a question or comment for each other based on what you've heard so far. Sheila and Daniel and Julie, you've listened to each other a bit. Was there something that came to mind? I've got other things I will raise if we are at a loss, but I'd love to let you all get this started directly. And you can just unmute and go ahead.
Yeah, I can
go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah. I can start. I have question for Sheila and Julie, and it's a discussion question. I think for Sheila, I found your concept of co-production really fascinating and resonates with the concept that I've used on hybrid governance, but also goes way back to the African philosophical ethics of Ubuntu, which organizes around the concept of I am because you are. So in that sense, then I guess what I wonder is to what extent you think co-production is something that is being newly introduced, or is something that is already part of the fiber, already existing. In other words, it's not something new, but something that the city has to rediscover itself, so to speak, something that's already existing. And I think for Julie, the point I had was, I love the whole concept of belonging, because I think it connects, for me, it moves beyond this inclusion, exclusion, moves into this whole aspect of the affect, the emotional, and also respects the subjectivity of the individual involved, that people feel belonging in different ways, and the need to really see people. But so what I wonder is, these move towards the city that flourishes, towards the city that is where all feel included. Is that something that's, is that something that is realistic or achievable? Can we really point to any city where all is included, where all is flourishing? So I think that's what I say. Is there what about the negative emotions? What about the fact that the city itself is a site of contradiction? That means that there's never really a city that really attains that level of flourishing. In other words, it's not so much the end as the process.
Great. Go ahead, Sheila, first, and then we'll come around to Julie.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think co-production is not new, but I do think it lands in different places very differently, in different cities have and places in general have different histories around it. In our work, in the Co-Cities work, we surveyed over 200 cities and 500 projects and policies in each city, exactly for this reason, to try to extract some lessons or principles around what does it mean to co-govern. And even when you have very good policies and very good intentions, and the local government wants to do the right thing. I mean, I love your idea of complexity, right? When co-governance hits a complex urban environment, we can't be romantic about the idea. We can't even be romantic about community, right? Communities are not always the answer, and they can't always do it by themselves. So I think co-production is a tool, is a framework that's useful. And as long as we stay away from romanticizing it, I think it can do some work, as long as we're constantly vigilant and skeptical. And I love your idea, and I want to hear more about what are the tensions and upsides of complexity, because I think that the thing that I've run into is exactly what you talk about, is the city as a complex ecosystem, really, and how it's very difficult to govern, both in a centralized way, but also in a decentralized way. So I'll stop there, but great question.
Great. Really, really helpful to hear that back and forth. And it leads nicely into Julie, kind of the realism and achievability of belonging.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Daniel. And I wish, in all honesty, that I could say that, oh, look at this city, it's been solved here. That like the work that we're doing is trying to bring solutions. And so it's a work in progress, much more work to be done, but do see steps towards positive outcomes. What you named around emotions, I think, is really critical. One way that we sometimes frame it is around narratives and the stories that get told, that stories are what motivate people. And right now with democratic backsliding, there's a lot of stories that are stoking fear of the other, fear of the unknown, fear of the future, fear of the pandemic. It's all based on fear. And so for us to actually speak on an emotional level around the narratives that people are actually searching for, that when we've got cities and communities where people do belong, where basic needs are met, that those are going to be beautiful places, and that like buying into fear is actually something that harms all of us. And then on the question of complexity and messiness. I love that question because the truth is that when Geir talks about methodology, it really does recognize the messiness. And it's a methodology that instead of just searching for individual strategies for individual problems, what we end up doing that by analyzing data and including people who are most impacted, then we tend to get to multiple solutions. So we also are developing strategies to mitigate the unintended consequences, but it is messy and it is complex, and it's why I love it, actually.
Well, I'm going to use moderator's prerogative here because a question just came in from Bevan in Louisville. And it's a perfect question to follow up this little give and take here. Where do those of us in communities start the conversation? Do we start with our neighbors? Do we start with our government representatives? It's been a challenge to open up these conversations and kind of get the ball rolling, partly because of that instinct of hurting feelings and kind of offending and human rights. And so how do we put this together? How do we get it started? And then I should also say, his last point was such amazing people here to all of you. So go ahead and someone take a shot at how do you get it started? All of you face this, surely, in your theories. Go ahead, Sheila, you went off mute.
Yeah, I'll just say this. That's such a great question. So we're working in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on a Coast City project. And I will say that my experience in cities, both here and abroad, first started working in Europe and Bologna, is that the way to get it started is to find a crack of a light in a slightly open door for you to walk through. And sometimes that is a city official, not the mayor, not a high level, but it can be an agency where someone is willing to walk this path with you. So that's the first thing, because I think that the city is a key enabler. The local government can be a key enabler, but it need not be government qua government. It can be that one person. So we've often started with one person who sees that we need to do something differently. And the second thing I think is it's both and. It's not start with the government or start with community. But I think the community part is really important. We have this idea called cheap talk, right? Which comes from Eleanor Ostrom. And the idea is that can you create spaces? And sometimes the cities have done this with urban labs. Can you create spaces where different people in a community come together, and not just who all believe in the same thing and want the same thing, but where there is that tension, so you can have low stakes talking with those folks? And how do you create those platforms? So I'll just stop there. So I think you need to do both. One is to find a little opportunity or just a little stream of light, and the other is to create opportunities for cheap talk in your communities among people who may be differently situated.
I love both. I love the crack of light and finding it. And I love cheap talk. You are saying cheap, G-E-C-H-E-A-P.
Right. Not to denigrate talk, but low stakes talking. Yeah.
Low stakes and easy access.
Exactly.
Not costly or expensive or any of those things. Daniel or Julia, do you want to chime in?
I think what I would say is that we have to also think about the notion of community as including the online community, and there are conversations that are happening in this virtual space, but that has real material effect in the physical space. And one way of getting that conversation starting is by looking at oneself and one's positionality, being reflective about one's own self, in the sense that if you take a classic online space, am I following people that reinforce the kind of ideas that I have in mind already? Or am I making the effort to follow other people that can expand my thinking, however radical, however contrarian, into other spaces, into spaces of hope, spaces of hopelessness, spaces of hurt, various spaces that reflect that. So I think those kind of questions can help us to move beyond the comfort zone, which is really what the city is, because the density of body is not just a choreography, it's also friction. And people, banter, people abuse each other on the road. So it's that space that we can recreate from ourselves by moving beyond the comfort zone of people. We're more comfortable with having those kind of conversations that reinforce our own ideas.
Great. It's become such a serious and important question. And I do think cities are really wringing their hands on it about how do we get people outside of these echo chambers and into more mixed conversation. Julie, anything you want to add quickly to this?
Yeah, the only thing that I would say is just looking at sort of the building of relationships and the relationships being a key component of organizing for change, recognizing that change has taken place primarily because of organizing to disrupt, but because of the fact that we've got people situated inside local government, that we are actually well situated to build power to govern. And that's what we want to do, to build governing power. So building relationships to that end goal.
Great, thank you. I've got a couple other questions from viewers, but I'm going to open up a topic here that I would love to hear all three of you on, and that is youth. GMF's been working with a researcher, Dr. Matthew McWilliams, also a GMF fellow, on research he's conducted with US youth between the ages of 18 to 29 years old and their perceptions of democracy. He's conducted similar research in Europe. The findings suggest that younger generations have less consistent support for democracy compared to previous generations. And while they support individual freedoms, they don't necessarily associate those freedoms with democracy at all. And sadly, don't feel that their voices matter. I'm going to start with you, Daniel, because as you know, this seems a bit counter to what you're offering in your essay about youth in African cities and the trajectory they are on to be supporters of democracy over authoritarianism. Can you just reflect on that a bit? And since you live in the US and you certainly are aware of both, give us your thoughts. I'll come around to Julie and Sheila after Daniel says a few
Absolutely, quickly. And you're right. I think I was looking at various polls that show that youth optimism is on the rise in Africa amidst the chaos and the crisis that is often portrayed in the media. And that's a puzzle for some people, but not so much for the people themselves who have never really who have always seen hope as imbued with contestation, with contradiction, but they can live with that. They can live with crisis. They can live with contradiction. I think that's something that the city allows them to do, because that's what the city does to you. And I think that what we saw, for example, in the movement in the fall of 2020, just on the back of George Floyd, the movement against police brutality in Nigeria and the NSAS, was not this notion of young people who are looking to exit the system, essentially disenchanted by what is going on. Rather, they were young people who were singing the national anthem, dancing in what you might call the festival of the oppressed, and they were shut down by the Nigerian government. But they were holding the national flag. These were not youth who were looking to, either exit the system or disrupt the system. These were youth who were looking to change the system from within, to voice their dissatisfaction, not against the state, but for the state. So even as they were calling for police accountability, they were also, and the abolishment of the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, the SARS, they were also calling for attention to the conditions under which the police were working. And that reflects in a way the votes that was made in Minneapolis, when predominantly Black neighborhoods voted the proposal to abolish the police. Yes. Suggesting that they don't just want posturing, they want better policing. So I think that nuance is what we see emerging in African contexts, where young people are able to live with contradiction. And I think that moves beyond this neat, ordered, formal city that I think Jane Jacobs' classic work, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, urges America to also emulate, when it says that the city is not just about formalism, it's about humanism. It's not just about standardization, order, neatness, homogeneity, but about diversity, spontaneity. And I think that's really the lesson here that we can learn, we meaning from the US here, looking at places like Nigeria or Kenya, about how young people there are working with the state and hoping for the states, despite the conditions under which they live.
Great. So this gives me an opportunity to plug another essayist, Scott Warren, who writes in the collection that and warns us not to misinterpret the actions of youth and to think that they are trying to leave, when in fact it might be that they are trying to reshape, and it's going to take a greater task for those inside government and inside structures to maybe understand what their actions are about. For Sheila and Julie, how do youth or next generations factor into your work on co-generation and advancing equity and belonging? Just if you can kind of give a youth notion to your thinking.
I'm going to cite two examples that come immediately to mind. One is I have a long history in working on environmental and climate justice and in marginalized communities on these issues, but also with a number of stakeholders. And the thing that I think is important to focus on is that the climate justice and the just transition movement are youth-led movements. And these are movements where the youth are not only in the streets and marching, but they're writing, they're bringing attention to this, and they're showing us the way, actually. And so it is not, and I love, Daniel's framing, it's not anti-state. Mm-hmm. It's transformation of the state. And the second example I'll give is that when I taught at Fordham, we had a relationship with a couple of Ghanaian institutions. I spent a lot of time in Accra in working with youth who wanted to change the system from within, anti-corruption. We work with the police, human rights, and these were, 100% youth. And it struck me that even more so, I think, in Africa than here, that youth are the future. They are shaping the future. They are very much involved in kind of changing the state from within, because they see their future as deeply implicated in how democratic the state is and how responsive the state is to their needs. So I'll just stop. So those are just two examples that come in. Yeah.
Very helpful. Thank you. Julie.
Yeah, I think in some ways, it's not surprising at all that we see a level of cynicism from youth, that sort of the reality of what has been portrayed as democratic has not been democratic. And so what Sheila and Daniel named around youth leading the way for new models, for the transformation of the system is spot on. And sort of for people who are sort of power holders within the system, like setting up structures so that we can actually test things out, pilot new ideas, and learn from them, but not just for the sake of learning, but for the sake of implementing. Having youth lead that is going to be critical for all of our future.
Great. Well, I sense certainly on some themes, there's kind of radical agreement, which is interesting, especially coming from your perspectives, and I appreciate that. Yeah, we've got about 6 minutes left, and I have a lot of places to go. Julie, I'm going to do one quick one with you. Ramon, who directs placemaking in Europe, asks, how can trauma-informed placemaking processes help to develop a more just urban democratic system, especially in places where trust has vanished? It's a tough, big question, but I suspect that you and OBI and GARE have thought about kind of this trauma-informed work. Can you take a crack at that?
Yeah, instead of recognizing the history and current reality of trauma is critical. And within the place-based work that Race Forward does, there's a couple of models where we have done organizing that has been initiated because of trauma, because of officer-involved shootings, where we actually did inside-outside organizing, where brought community together. Community was already together, actually, organizing in protests, but did organizing inside the city, did not bring them together immediately because it was too raw. There had to be a basis of understanding before, and a lack of or to decrease defensiveness before engagement could take place. And so really recognizing that sort of we do need broad scale systems change. We need transformation of institutions, and having community be the sort of the home for where that happens, how it gets led is critical. The work has been going, and this is in Monterey and Salinas, work there has been going on for about 6 or 7 years. And they just finished this year-long process where they were looking at inequities across multiple areas. So it turns out, wasn't just criminal justice. It was housing, it was education, it was transportation. The reality that there were deep and pervasive inequities, racial inequities across every single indicator for success, they used to organize around, but then they built relationships between the different topic areas, because people never, like, turns out that people want housing in a neighborhood where there's a good school. So you can't really just it's the nature of structural racism. So you need to be able to organize across multiple topics, but always putting the community at the center.
So sometimes I am overwhelmed, but most times I am so energized by knowing what cities and communities have the potential to do. And I just wish I could somehow understand it all and grasp it all. So I'm going to close with a question to all of you about the reputation that cities have gotten, and part of the premise of this collection, and ask, do cities deserve the reputation as innovators that they've garnered over the past 2 decades? Are they doing enough? Are they, and so the question is, kind of in your work in this mashup, are cities living up to the hope that others have laid on them, that they're the ones that can lead the way on so much of this work? Anyone can dive in.
I will say that an important question to ask is, can cities do more? So, you know, as a legal and policy scholar, when my students talk about all the things they want cities to do, one of the things I think it's important for them to understand is what cities have the authority to do, the structural constraints on cities, including where they get their money from. And as you know, I was helped Ben Barber launch the Global Parliament of Mayors and served as the co-chair of the advisory board. And I think this is a problem for global cities. Some American cities have a lot more room to do more. But when you scope more globally, particularly in the South, in the global South, they're far more constrained in terms of finances and legal authority. Mm-hmm. So I think part of the democratic process has got to be, and Ben Barber was very strong in this, getting cities more power to do more that we want them to do. So I'll stop there. That's the only point I want to make.
I'll say amen to that. Daniel or Julie? Julie, you want to dive in? We'll close with Daniel.
Yeah, I would say, cities can and should be doing more, and need to be doing more with greater urgency. Just what's at risk right now, the future of our country, future of the globe, that there's a lot at risk right now, and really do believe that cities with the appropriate level of strategy and intervention and urgency can make a huge difference. So love what's being done and want to see more happen.
Super. Daniel?
And Stephen, quickly, I would say that in the context, certainly of African cities that I have studied closely, I think cities are doing more with less. I think the problem is that the government's policy is not open-ended, so their pursuit of modernization does not allow them to see spaces that they have described as just passive spaces that they have called non-spaces, like informal spaces, where we have seen entrepreneurship, we're seeing innovation, we're seeing creativity. So cities just need to see what is going on. In South Africa, the good morning greeting was Sawubona, which is I see you. And I think that's what cities need to do. They just need to see the vast majority of their economy, which is in the so-called informal sector, but which is driving change and innovation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for the candor that you brought and the conciseness which you brought, which is really difficult. We have sadly run out of time, although certainly not things to discuss. But alas, for the viewers, if you want to know more, just click on the link of the essay collection and enjoy the details in all their glory. A big thanks to Sheila, Daniel, and Julie for your contributions and your candor, to both GMF and the Chicago Council for their support of this project, and to all of you that attended for your interest and the energy we hope you will bring to grow strong, free cities and vibrant democracies. Take good care and goodbye.